So, you've drawn the Netherlands in Imperial Diplomacy, and this is a video that I'm very excited to make in particular because the Dutch are actually my favourite power in all of the game. I'd say I've played them 3 times now, and each of those times I've had good fun on the power. Their colonies in particular, obviously, is what for me makes them such a unique power compared to anyone else. Just the regions they have strength in, and the way that some of their smaller colonies functions in the dynamics of those regions just makes it a really engaging game to play. Starting off with the positives of the power, the Dutch has some of the best lines for growth early of any of the colonials. You have great influence in some of the most dot dense areas on the map. You have great ability to project over Southeast Asia with the fleet play, and South America in particular are probably going to be your two biggest points of strength. Apart from that, you get to press everyone on the board. You have such a good reach into all the regions in the map. So as far as cross-board press goes, you just have a lot of influence in how the dynamics across the board plays out. And yeah, it's just a very interesting game generally, as well as having one of the easiest year one doubles of any of the colonials. Really the only one that's ever particularly likely to do it at all. Traditionally, the Dutch has been a really strong power, but I'd say particularly in more recent patches, the Dutch has taken a bit of a hit. Mainly, this is because IU post rework has become a really dominant power in Southeast Asia, which means even if you're allied with them and wanting to hit the Spain, you have to be a bit more careful about the amount of space you give them. Or if you're wanting to slap them early, you really have to be more precise about the stab that you make, maybe get more people on side, and it's maybe going to take people longer. So you're delaying your Portuguese or Spanish stab later into the game, which might not be ideal for you. As well as that, the Dutch kind of have timeless problems, such as they have a few kind of really weak colonies. Formosa, in particular, really struggles to get off the ground. Tokugawa always seems to be on a good patch. Maybe slightly less so now with the recent changes as well. So I'm hoping that we're going to see more play in the Formosa colonies for Duchess in games and waves to come. Kind of their famous big issue really is the fact that they only start on 2 centres in Europe, which leaves them really exposed to just getting coalitioned. If the alliance structure among the colonials is an EF in particular, which is also a really common alliance that's being played more and more nowadays, as well as with Austria, Poland, Sweden. You just have a lot of exposure to the board in this area, which means it can be quite easy just to get coalitioned or die, or make a mistake in your build, lose the region in winter. And because of how the capitals work, if you don't have your capital, you can't win the game. This can be sometimes impossible for a Dutch to come back from, because if you're looking at retaking your capital all the way over in Europe, maybe you still have a crazy good SAO position and you've done really well in the whole map, but you've somehow just died in Europe. You're going to have to come up and do some sort of like NAO crusade, get through the Isles, and it's just not really going to happen. I'm not sure how many times it has happened that they've managed to retake their capital. The only one I can really think of is A2J3, which I'll chuck up on the screen now, which was our very own Luxon who did that. Additionally, with how strong some of the other colonials are, like Portugal and France, who are on these really good patches recently and that we often see get into these really dominant positions, the Dutch are often a power which takes the full brunt of both of those other powers being strong. So I thought that we'd kind of start off the video by having a look at each one of the Dutch's colonies, looking at some of the openings there, maybe some of their dynamics, thinking about what do you want to do and what are your potential press lines you're going to be trying to working and what your expansion in the region really looks like. So I thought we'd start over in Formosa, which is definitely considered to be one of the Dutch's weaker colonies for good reason, really. You have a lot of trouble holding this colony a lot of the time. In my opinion, this is mainly to do with Tokugawa. Tokugawa, depending on how they open, are probably going to end up in like Kyushu and Bonin Islands at the end of 01, which means they're always going to be justified to come and hit you in Ryukyu Islands and Formosa. It's set up a little bit like the Arabian colony is for Safavids in a way, that it's almost considered this sort of dot bank which Toku can cash in on whenever they want. because a key part of Toku's game is Kyushu current control. They always have A, justification to be there, and B, ability to stab for Ryukyu Islands at will. Especially if they're doing this opening where they put Kyoto into Kyushu, they're struggling to move that away. And you can never really move Formosa or Ryukyu Islands away because you're leaving yourself open for an easy stab where, especially if they're in Bonin Islands and Kuroshio Current, suddenly you can lose your entire colony in a single phase. And on the flip side of that, even if you play your dynamics really well, which we'll go into in a moment, and you see a weak Toku, that's often going to be symptomatic of a big Ming. And if you see a big Ming position, at some point, they're going to want to be pumping fleets out, whether they're anti-Qing or anti-Toku. Obviously, if you have a weak Toku, very likely they're going to be anti-Toku too. So they're going to be in these tiles like Yellow Sea, East China Sea, building fleets to send down, to hit Portugal. And you get to a point with a big Ming where they're going to have all these fleets left over after a dead Toku, which, yes, they can push out through like Kyushu and down through Macau, Hainan, Luzon straight into Spain. But it's going to be much easier for them just to stab you for Formosa and Ryukyu Islands. And if you don't have that strength yet, you're often just going to get completely walked over, and there's nothing you're going to be able to do about it in the face of a power in the region which just has a lot more strength than you do. So if you're opening, you're obviously just going to be walking to Ryukyu Islands. But you do have some interesting things you can do in the region. Namely, an opening that I really love, which is kind of getting played more and more, is this Kyushu Crusher. So for the Dutch, you press the Ming into East China Sea, and for there you offer them support into Kyushu in fall. For me, I love this opening mainly for a few reasons, really. Firstly, strong Toku is often your lose con in the region. It's how ultimately you're going to end up dying a lot of the time. So, by putting a bit of a hamstring on Toku's game early, as well as a target on their back, because you're putting the Ming in Kyushu, which means they're often going to be building like Kyoto, Osaka, and from there, they're not going to be able to justify building units like Aomori and Edo, which is going to leave them really open in the north from powers like Qing and Inuit to come and capitalize on. And obviously, if they're at war with those powers, Toku is then at less risk of just coming into your face and whacking you out of Ryukyu Islands at their leisure. This opening also stops Nanking from coming south. You really don't want them opening Kwangtung Estuary, forcing a Gesso 1, or even worse, getting supported into Ryukyu Islands by Kyushu. So it's really nice for that reason. And Toku do have openings where they play into Kuroshio Current and Kyushu, and then they can literally just force Ryukyu Islands for 301. And if you don't have Ming tapping that support from Kyushu, there's really nothing you can do about it, and you're just pretty much losing your colony for absolutely no reason. So the dynamics you really want to be playing in the region is quite balance of power focused. You obviously are going to want to be growing this colony if you at all can. Obviously, that's the aim of it. And you'll find that the most natural lines of growth, because in Formosa you're going to be building fleets, is going to be over A, towards the Spanish, or B, into Tokugawa. As we've already discussed, a strong Tokugawa carries quite a lot of risk for the Dutch position. So if you can be working with Spain here, take dots like Bonin Islands, Kyushu, look towards getting the Spanish into Kuroshio Current, or even you. You can then start looking towards Kyushu, Osaka, and it's a really dot-dense region. It solves a lot of your issues, and it feels like a really nice route of growth for the Dutch, kind of moving into the mid and later portions of the game. Ultimately, though, the best thing you can ever do with Formosa is connect it to your Southeast Asia colony, which we'll get to in a moment. But Southeast Asia is a point where the Dutch arguably is able to project the most power on the map. If you can connect Formosa through the Philippines, through Spain, suddenly Formosa goes from this disconnected, awful one-dot colony, which you're likely to lose at every time, to a forward core in your front line as you're pushing out into tiles like Macau, Hainan, Kyushu, and the colony just gets a lot more strength. Taking the Philippines is really nice just for the dots, and then you're using it as a front to project power either into NPO. Again, a nice avenue towards breaking Toku or fighting Spain further if you want. Or you can use it equally to fight IU, who, if you're attacking Spain early, which is a decent plan with how the dynamics will pan out in South America as well, at that point you may need to be going back, stabbing IU, trying to keep them in the box as well. Ultimately, though, while getting a really good game off in Formosa can be nice, and it is possible, we've seen a few good ones. I'll put one up again now, actually. A2J3 was a nice one, and there's been a couple others. If you do lose this colony, it's not the end of the world. And this is a philosophy which is true for the Dutch especially, but it's true for all colonials as well. If you do need to sack the colony for the builds, and if you're overbuilt in a region which never has the potential to get you anything more, it is fine to be taking units off in retreat to build them in better places elsewhere across the map. And it's fine to be taking them as disbands. If you lose Formosa, you can still have a great game in Southeast Asia, across the Atlantic Ocean, and hopefully even in places like NA and Africa. Moving down south now into Southeast Asia, this is the colony where the Dutch really get the most play. You're often going to be doubling Hero 1 relatively unopposed. It's quite easy double, and you also have Ceylon, which isn't directly part of your Southeast Asia game, but it really ties in quite closely with it. And as you're always taking Palembang 1, you can pretty much connect it up almost instantly and start projecting power across INO. So for the Dutch, your game here is really very interesting. You've got two main fronts. One is against the Spanish and Ayutthaya, focusing that way, and one is against Portugal to your south. So the first bit of press you're really going to have to do in the region is talking to the Portuguese about which of the dots they're taking. During my Dutch game, I was actually hoping to play a Netherlands-Portugal alliance, and so I pitched the Portuguese on actually me taking Danny and then taking Flores. Obviously, with the Portuguese in Danny, because it's a pre-core of theirs, they always have the option to stab for Helm of Heresy, and then suddenly they're building 2 units. And while at the beginning of the game, the Dutch is able to project a lot more power than the Portuguese in the region, that dynamic can shift very quickly if they get a decent stab on you for like Flores and Manado Borg or something, and then suddenly they're able to build 2 fleets in the region. So giving them Danny does a couple things for me. It reduces your border tension quite a lot, I think, because with Timor and Flores, if the Dutch have Flores and the Portuguese obviously have their core in Timor, you've got that constant threat of Flores getting dotted. The Portuguese in Flores makes for a bit of a safer border where they can feel more comfortable about projecting power towards Australia against Mapuche, moving to tiles like Timor Sea and Coral Sea towards O2. Danny, you can obviously just like sit there and core it, help against Mapuche and Australia, or you can pull out to Helm Heresy towards MPO to support your Formosa game, or to attack the Spanish. And there's really a lot of very useful things Danny can do for you as a fleet. Towards your north, your decision early is very much going to be, do I want to work with Ayutthaya here, or do I want to work with the Spanish? Both really have their merits, and it really depends chiefly on what you're going to be wanting to do on the other side of the board over towards South America. But here, I really believe there's no right or wrong answer. And it's also going to depend on what you want to do with Formosa, like we talked about before. For me, I do think connecting Formosa to the rest of your Southeast Asia cause is really important, and I think it is really powerful for the Dutch. And if you can do that, start getting cores around Manila, and you're connecting up, it is just going to be a great thing for your game, and it's going to make Southeast Asia this real bastion of power for you. But equally, you have nice lines into Ayutthaya too, especially if you can get people like Ming and Mughals attacking them so they're not full building 01, or if you can get the majority of armies for them, you are going to have some nice lines into taking Andaman Islands and Sambas especially really easily in 02, which can be a really nice and simple line for you. Just you're taking 1 or 2 dots pretty safely most of the time if you get a half decent stab in, and it comes with a lot less jeopardy to your colonial alliances, depending on how else you're going to be playing those out across the rest of the board. Ayutthaya, as we already talked about, is a super strong power this patch. So no matter what you're playing, you will want to be pressing your mutual neighbours, like Portugal, like Mughals, like Ming, to make sure they're not giving too much space to play the game in. Because if you're hitting Spain for Philippines but then getting stabbed in the back by Ayutthaya, that's obviously not worth it. And you really don't want to be letting Ayutthaya out the box. They've been starting to feel more and more like Turkey in every patch. With their Precor and Udong as well, they can really easily project power southeast, which is literally the opposite direction of where you want them going. I do think that you can have a really long and viable alliance with Ayutthaya, but I do think it strongly relies on Ayutthaya not overbuilding fleets and playing a mainly army-focused game, which is a really strong strategy for them. And I definitely like it for Ayutthaya too. But if you see Ayutthaya overbuilding fleets, I think you have to kind of prepare for a fight because after they've taken all these dots like Hainan and even consolidated around India and Ganges Delta, Sekar Coast, as you're moving into the mid and late game, these fleets are going to hit somewhere, right? And they're going to have to hit somewhere. Now, the traditional opening with Ceylon is to send it into INO and then send it into Palembang as you then walk into Akka, or however you pronounce it. I really like this opening. I think it's quite nice for you, especially if you want to have lines into IUO2. It sets you up quite nicely for some sort of Andaman Islands take. I also really don't hate giving it to England either. I mean, it is their pre-core, and it really gives Ayutthaya an incentive to be hitting England. You can try and press them towards hitting towers like Sukkur Coast and Bay of Bengal, and it reduces your tension with IU, which can be a really nice boon if you're wanting to hit Spain early in the Philippines. And it can really make that border with Ayutthaya feel a lot less oppressive and quite a lot more playable, really. That means you'll most likely be sending Ceylon over to Madurai, which is it's a bit of a dead end tile, but it's also quite a fine place to be. Ceylon does connect to Vendad. You often don't see any sort of Dutch India games, but there's no real reason why not. You put it in Madurai, it has opportunity towards Cochin if you are playing some sort of Portugal stab, or even just walking Palakar for some sort of Madras grab. But all in all, I think there's quite a limited reasons not to go into INO and play towards your Southeast Asia colony more. It's definitely a position you want to be focusing on as it's a really strong bastion of power for you as you move into the mid and late game. And it is just a really solid place for the Dutch to be getting more and more fleets early. Additionally, playing into INO in spring gives you a lot of opportunity dotting Reunion, which looks really nice as we move over to South America. So in South America, Maritstad is 9 times out of 10 going to be opening for Cape Cohir. It's a pre-core, which is nice for you, and is also a way for the Dutch to connect their South Atlantic and INO positions, which are two of the high seas that the Dutch really want to play around most with their strong Southeast Asia and their strong Atlantic presence with their South American and African colonies. Connecting these up is really powerful, as kind of for all colonials, the more centralized you are, the more powerful you are. It's why the game is kind of intrinsically balanced because although regionals are much smaller, they always have a more centralized point of power which they can expand out from, which just means they have more and more cores which are supplying units for the front lines but are not under attack because they're protected by the walls of units. In this way, you have anti-France lines 01 where you dot reunion from INO. And when you start looking at it like we did in Formosa with centralizing your power, connecting up your positions, which is as important for the Dutch as it is for any power, suddenly it looks quite nice. You're combining it with some sort of Crozet Basin force come Spring 02, where you're really playing just to completely cut France out of Madagascar, especially strong, in my opinion, if you're playing with Portugal, because you can really pitch them on moving in for Barra and Mapondo. Obviously, you have to be careful with openings like these, where you're dotting cores in year one, but dotting these high sea cores is really powerful for any colonial. You're denying them the chance to build in the end of the year one, but also in year two, they can't build the core either, because even if they do retake it, they have to spend all of year two retaking it, which means it's covered for that fall. And then they can only have the opportunity to build it by year three. And the hope is then by year three, you're going to have plenty of units in INO and around the high seas to be able to tap and take it. And you've killed their tempo sufficiently so that you are then the major power in the region. And I don't think INO is a particular exception to this. The only thing that you have to be considerate of is you're making the French an enemy, which, while their Madagascar position isn't super scary for you, especially compared to the power that you can usually muster, they definitely can create issues for you in North America and chiefly in Europe. So, usually, if you were to play one of these openings, you either need to be confident in your press with the French that even though you dot them, you can work something out moving into O2, or you need to be really confident in your press in the English that you're just going to be able to EN here, get England on side, and kill France pretty much all over the board. If you do dot reunion and you bait an EF off it, your game does get very hard, and that's the chief way that most Dutches lose. Playing this sort of high seas Dutch though around INO and South Atlantic, especially if you are able to connect it up though, does feel really nice. Especially looking towards Africa, you can see that you have quite a large border with Congo. And if you're able to project more and more power towards the South Atlantic Ocean with your Cape Cope pre-core, you can get really nice lines into the mid-game to be able to force tiles like Angola Basin and get more fleets into Congo and be able to take and move into that direction later and later into the game. In terms of your West Africa position, you start with 2 armies there, which is more than most other powers, apart from Portugal, but you do have Congo to deal with on your southern border. Now, most of the time, I would argue that if possible, Congo should be friend and not food. Oftentimes, you'll see these powers fighting, usually over hotspots like this Mandara Bayer border, and also Sao Tome Lopez Bay is a real point of contention for them. But Congo can have a perfectly good game playing east, and it's often more profitable for the Dutch to be playing into West Africa against the colonials like England or even like Ottomans. This is chiefly because just Congo are way stronger off the bat than any of the other powers in the region are. Ottomans will come down and take Timbuktu or Agadez, and England only start with the 1.2. So if you can, you're just going to get easier progress over into West Africa, and further and further into the game, that's a region which is more viable to hold and build a corner position off, rather than having to spend loads of builds on fleets from your South American colony to come in and break Congo. And you'll often find that you're not even the chief winner of breaking down Congo because other powers, usually Portugal, usually Ajuran, are able to get so many more armies into them. And in the end, when your prize is a fleet in Mabanza and a fleet in Soyo, you realize that it wasn't really worth the push, and the power behind them has benefited a lot more. And I would say the Congo feels similarly about this most of the time. They don't love to be playing into the Dutch, and unless you leave yourself open for it and aren't taking precautions like prearranged route bounces in Luango or Nuri or Sanka or something like that to keep your border secure, usually the border can just devolve into something where neither of you gain, neither of you make progress. So hopefully you'll have good press with the Congo. I don't think always allying with the Congo is the move, but it's definitely something that you should be aware of and consider as a really viable option for your game, which it is. Apart from that, in West Africa, Sao Tome is a super key tile for you, and you can't justify not taking Sao Tome. Most of the time, I do think that it's not a massive issue for you and Congo. You have 3 dots next to the Gulf of Guiana already, and 2 of these being your only pre-cores in the region. So I do think it's quite easy for you to justify to Congo and say, look, we can be friends, we'll arrange bounces in Lopez Bay, I'm not going to overbuild fleets in the region, but Gulf of Guiana is such a key tile for me. I need Sao Tome to be able to kind of like function this alliance. Apart from that, I'm happy to give you the space to push your fleets elsewhere, push your armies elsewhere, and hopefully we can help each other out. If you can't press your way into Sao Tome, I would honestly have no qualms about just you build the fleet anyway and you just bounce them out. It is tough, but it's not really a tile that you can afford to see Congo in my opinion, or at least not be able to do that without sitting a fleet in Gulf of Guiana for the rest of the game. As for South America, your game plan here is very much tied in with the dynamics around the rest of the board. If you're playing anti-France, that's really going to lead itself maybe to pro-Spain, as you're going to be wanting to send like Parmerbo and Amerson after this Cayenne Kalina colony looking in O2. It's one of those quick wins as a Dutch where you can really just take the dots, it's 2 dots, and it centralizes your position, gets you more outlets into SAO, and a bit of control over this Guyana current tile. A key theme, I think, for the Dutch, really, as we've talked about already, is connecting up your positions. And between South America and the Caribbean, this is really no exception. For the Dutch in the Caribbean, the starting point of any good Dutch Caribbean game is always going to be this four center core of Saint Martin, Puerto Rico, Guadeloupe, and Antigua. And from there, if you have Guyana current control, suddenly you're opening all sorts of doors to a really strong Caribbean game, which, we've seen multiple times from the Dutch. And because Saint Martin is quite a good colony for the Dutch, it's situated with high dot density. So if you can be building in the Caribbean, you usually should. And you have a really good opportunity for a nice Caribbean game, which not from a power that you'd usually expect. Though on the flip side of that, the Caribbean is just another place that you can get harmed if you don't manage to press out of the EF, which can really harm your game. But like we're talking about, if you do manage to connect your South American and Caribbean colonies through Guyana Current, suddenly you're putting so much pressure on either the Spanish or the Polish around New Zealand or Barbados and Caracas, and it's just a whole other avenue of dots you're opening yourself up to. It's also going to work really well with your South Atlantic Ocean game because you're going to be able to easily rotate your units around it from Guyana currently with C. If you want, you can start rotating units and fleets through the South Atlantic, feeding your Caribbean colony from your South American, from your African colonies, which can sometimes be slower compared to the Caribbean's overwhelming dot density, which can make it a really strong foundation for any colonials game. And the Dutch is no exception to that, even though you don't traditionally think of them as a Caribbean power. In South America as well, a lot of playing the dynamics is about managing this triangle between you, Spain, and Aymara. You obviously don't want to be on the receiving end of a Spain Aymara, but you really can afford to kind of chill here, make slow progress, and as long as your position isn't getting worse, you're improving in the long run. Centralizing around this three-center core of Amazonia, Japora, and Iperina at some point is always going to be really nice for your game, as well as looking maybe to get a core in the Amazon or something. If things are slower and you can afford to take a little bit of a hit to your tempo, just to wait things out in South America, potentially if you're combining this with pro Spain in Southeast Asia, which is a very natural thing to do, maybe you're hitting Aymara and you can afford to maybe to put the Spanish in Iperina, even if you're then just setting up a stab for this three cores of dots. Hitting south into Portugal is also super nice. You generally have better options to stab them than they do you, because you're easily being able to justify building fleets in Meritstad and just like being in Goiás. Obviously, if you're fighting Aymara for like Iperina, suddenly as well, if you've got this South Atlantic Ocean control, you're working Torres os Santos, Bahia, and you're just taking dots like Salvador, Rio de Janeiro very fast. And kind of as always, when you're stabbing colonials, you really want to be doing it on a turn where they're not building. And it doesn't matter if your stab is predominantly for position, even if it's in fall, which goes against like quite a lot of the advice you hear. But stabbing for position in fall is fine if they're not building, right? Because the worry usually with stabbing for position is full is you're not actually getting the builds and you're not taking the builds away from them, so they can retaliate against you. But obviously if they don't have those builds and you're keeping that position come spring, then it's completely fine. If you can be stabbing for dots in fall or position in spring, that's usually the best way to do it, right? Because you're stabbing with a position in spring to then take the dots in fall, then you're building in winter, and it just really helps keep your tempo up, which is super nice. Moving over to New Amsterdam, which is a very tricky colony for the Netherlands to play. New Amsterdam has quite a unique weakness of being super intertwined with these powers like France and England that often have a lot to gain from working together, and also you're the weakest in the region, which often makes it very difficult to play. Now, my one key piece of advice here would be is that you have to play proactively in this colony, and you have to play for this colony if you really want to win the region. You're not going to be able to win this region, and maybe even the game, if you don't play for your NA. More than the position that NA gets you, it's the leverage it gives you over the EF. While you're still here in NA, there's always that threat of the EF flipping on one another, and you always kind of have that wrench in their relationship to kind of make something happen. Once you're out of the region, it's very easy for that just to snowball into a game on EF in which the Dutch is never ultimately favoured because you're going to be losing your European position. And once you lose your European position, then you're kind of out of the game. Playing proactively in NA, what that really means is not just building there whenever you get the opportunity to, 9 times out of 10. It maybe means, say, bouncing the French out of Seneca in O2. Your natural growth path on the Dutch is going to be Philadelphia 01, obviously. It's your pre-core, it's your natural. But you'll often find that France doesn't walk Seneca 01. And then you have the opportunity to bounce them out of Seneca. This covers the core in Ville Marie, and it means so they can't build in Ville Marie. And it sets you up for a Seneca take 02 because you're saying you're building an army in New Amsterdam, you're walking Oneida, then you can force Seneca, and that's obviously looking super nice if you're playing some sort of EN. On the flip side of that, obviously you have other lines where you're walking like Connecticut, Oneida, but whatever you do in the region, you have to play proactively, because if you're not playing proactively and you're not growing, every year you're falling behind, as France and England are both pumping builds into the region. It's both of those powers win con, right? Because the dot density in NA is so good as it is in the Caribbean, and it's a really important place for both of those powers to win, which is ultimately what gives you so much leverage in the relationship and in the board. You can have a really strong Dutch NA game. It takes tempo and it takes really good press from the EF, kind of bouncing them against each other, but we'll probably come that into a bit as it's a really key relationship for the Dutch everywhere. Another place that this relationship is very apparent is in Europe, where you have this two dot core. You basically have two key options in the region. You're either sending the army into Ghent or you're sending the fleet into Ghent, right? Which means that you're either going to have a fleet in Bremen or you're going to have an army in Bremen. Now, most of the time, I actually think it's much better to put the fleet into Ghent. Managing your relationship with the EF is all about press, but as well as press, it's all about the incentives you can give them both to one another to make it more enticing for them to hit one another, for them to hit you. One of the ways you can do this is with your fleet in Ghent, right? Because you're then in position to support one of them into the English Channel, which is a really key tile if any of them wants to break down the other one in Europe, or you're offering to go into Southern Bight to attack England, maybe walking Normandy. But the fleet here just gives you a lot more leverage over the relationship, which the Dutch has a more limited supply of than the French and the English have on each other, right, in NA, because they are so very intertwined. As well as that, I really like having the army in Bremen. It's slightly more anti-Polish, but it just gives you a lot more flexibility over the region. If you have a fleet in Bremen, you can't touch Berlin, you're not touching Lubeck, which I almost feel like locks you in a little bit to playing anti-Sweden, which is kind of fine. Poland Dutch is quite nice as well. It's one of those relationships which can work out really well for you over in the Caribbean and South America, because you can be like hitting the Spanish together, you can be hitting the French together, and as two smaller powers in the Caribbean, obviously neither one of you want to see a massive English, a massive Spain, so it could be quite a nice relationship. Obviously in West Africa too, so there's kind of all these regions that you and the Polish can collaborate on, which I think makes it a really powerful relationship. It's definitely one that I played in my Dutch game. Now, I mentioned it a bit already, but there's really two key places where the Dutch go wrong. And the first of those, I would say, is not playing proactively enough into O2. In O1, it's completely fine to play a neutral opening. The Dutch are one of the few powers that can really double without annoying anyone, getting in anyone's way, which can set you up nicely in O2 for quite like a flexible start. You can go in any direction you want. But you see a lot of Dutch is playing quite non-committally, and in my opinion, this is kind of a massive mistake. In lots of the regions where the Dutch are weakest, it's often the easy choice for lots of their neighbours just to hit them out of the region. For example, if you're not really pressing these England-France dynamics hard, England will say, okay, well, I'll take New Amsterdam, France, you can take Philadelphia or whatever, and then you kind of can take it from there in their relationship. And if they do decide that, there's pretty much nothing you can do about it. Similar sort of story in Europe. You have a weaker position and you have the leverage, but that leverage isn't worth anything if you don't actually use it. And kind of leads on to the second point, which is you have to press out the EF. And it is tricky because EF is a very played alliance. It is a strong alliance, and there is kind of merit for both England and France to play it, especially early. But there are also good reasons for them not to, right? And these are what you want to be pointing out. You want to be enticing one to stab the other. Obviously, things like offering the support into English Channel. For the French, maybe you're saying, okay, I'm hitting them in the Caribbean. They're really strong in the Caribbean. Ultimately, really strong England. They're going to stab you at some point. EFs are generally considered, and I would agree, to be more England focused as you move towards the mid and late game, because obviously, mopping up the Dutch, England's really taking a corner position on the continent, and then the French are being asked to push out in front of the English, which often gives England a really good stab opportunity from behind. That's one of the major pitches I would use to France if you maybe want to play some sort of Netherlands-France. But at this point, unless you have the pick, which you might have your pick of alliances between the French and the English if they hate each other and you've pressed it out really well, but you really just need to get one of them on side against the other. Playing in either anti-English O2 or an anti-French O2 is kind of completely fine. You have some nice lines into Cayenne, Reunion. In Europe, it's fine. You're maybe taking Seneca in North America if you're playing pro-England, anti-France. If you're playing anti-England, it works out really nicely in the Caribbean because we talked about it, but this 4-dot core is super powerful, super hard to break down once you get it online, and you're kind of getting connected up through Guyana Current to your South American colony. It's also super nice for starting to move west in West Africa. We talked about how England is weaker to start with, and there's lots of good growth opportunity over there. So maybe you're wanting to play some sort of pro-Congo O2, and you're hitting England, and it works out really nicely. So it's completely fine which way you decide to go, and that can be completely press and vibes dependent or whatever. It's only when it becomes an EF that you have a massive issue. The only things you'd maybe consider are the later you go into playing a France-Netherlands, the stronger of a European position the French are likely to get, and obviously the French pose a greater threat to your European position than the English do, just because they start with so many armies near you, and they can easily push these tiles because they're going to be in Strasbourg, they're going to be in Paris always justifiably. So they can push like Reims, Normandy, Cologne, and suddenly your European position is looking kind of quite stressed and quite hurt, and that's like the one stab which can lose you the game. And that's the thing about the Dutch is you have a lot of strength and you are a strong power, you are a colonial, even though you're one of the weaker colonials, but you're very brittle. You need things to go right, and if things start going wrong as the Dutch, things start going very wrong. Because hitting a strong Dutch for players like Ayutthaya, Congo, a lot of the regionals is not super appealing sometimes. For Ayutthaya versus the Dutch on their own, they're really going to struggle just to break down the region. But if the Dutch starts disbanding, it's a very kind of prominent coalition target early. Everyone's just like, let's go beat up the Dutch. The Congo like to do it just because if they had it their way, it's very easy just for them to eat your West Africa position, and then they can start playing west into the hopefully still divided colonials if they can get that win early. And the story's kind of very similar wherever you look on the board. So it's about pressing proactively, and you'll need to be pitching things like people anti-Ayutthaya, people anti-Toku. If you want a chance of keeping your Formosa colony, you'll probably be wanting to pitch people anti-Congo. While an alliance with them is good, you obviously don't want a Congo that's too strong, because of Congo that's too strong, if they're building fleets, these are obviously eventually coming out to you. And if they're crushing Abyssinia, they're always going to have that position around like Azande, Darfur, just a flood west, and at some point completely destroy your colony because you're not going to be able to keep up builds-wise in the region. Biggest key to playing the Dutch, you could maybe argue this for any power, but I think it's especially prevalent in how the Dutch plays, is that your press is going to need to be really strong. And it seems like kind of a moot point, but The Dutch really need to be able to press out their dynamics, and even a small mistake like letting Austria get too big because you're overhitting Poland or you're overhitting France, and then suddenly you're losing your lowlands Europe position for no reason. We've already talked about Formosa and Ceylon. All these colonies are super easy to lose. So you're going to need to be confident in pressing out your dynamics. You're going to need to be decisive in your direction. But if you can do these things and you can get your positions off the ground into year 2 and year 3, and you start condensing your position, you start centralizing your power bases around the kind of powerful regions you have on the board, like Southeast Asia, like the Indian Ocean, like South America and the South Atlantic, you can start building these positions which are really, really hard to break down. And going into the mid and the late game, the Dutch has some of the best potential to rush solos and duos compared to any other power on the board. More than that, the Dutch is a really fun power in terms of you have to rely on your press and you have to press these dynamics which are good for you. And if you do that, you can end up with some incredibly cool positions like massive Dutch Caribbeans, massive Dutch NAs. I know we've already talked about A2J3, but it's a really good example of both of these things. Big Formosas and Pacific games, which are like a bit like mine in 1R, and generally just a really fun power to play with how much influence you have on the board, the people you press, and kind of the way the game usually shapes out. If you're thinking of giving the Dutch a go, I would say it's definitely not for the faint of heart, but it's a really fun playthrough. They can be a really strong power, and I would just say go for it. Thank you very much for watching. That'll be all from me, and I'll see you next time.